This is the SSH presentation by Mohammed Mustaf. Introduction to SSH. Secure Shell, or SSH, is a network protocol with encryption capabilities that allows users to access the server remotely and run commands on an insecure network. SSH is the secure replacement for the old protocols of rlogin and telnet. So like I said, Secure Shell or SSH is a network protocol with encryption capabilities that allow users to access the server remotely and run commands on an insecure network. SSH is the secure replacement for the old protocols of rlogin and telnet. SSH authentication methods. So, of course, SSH has some authentication methods. SSH supports a variety of authentication methods. So, for example, one method would be password authentication. Password authentication, as we know, it just confirms that it's actually your password. Public key authentication is another one. And also multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication is used, for example, in KSU when you're logging into D2L or AliExpress. It makes you call your phone most of the time, or you can do Face ID if you're on a laptop, depending on what device you're using. There's multiple different things. These methods should be known as SSH connection security. SSH authentication methods. So, one would be use public key authentication. It is more secure than passwords. It is always more secure than passwords. Another one would be enable multi-factor authentication because it doesn't hurt. It might take an extra 10 seconds of your time, but it adds that extra layer of security that you might need. So for example, like I said, KSU uses it, and I think most school systems use it in college for logging into AliExpress and D2L. Third one would be disable password authentication. Because once a public key is set up, you don't need password-based login anymore. So you can just get rid of it. It's not as necessary. Configuring SSH security for security. SSH should be correctly configured for preventing unauthorized access. Make sure it's correctly configured for preventing unauthorized access. So, disabling the root login is one thing you could do. Employing strong encryption protocols is another thing you could do. And also, one last thing is limiting the access based on the IP address are some of these configurations that you can use. This helps limit unauthorized access. It's for the protection of your data. It might require spending some money or taking some time, but it is very worth it in the end. So, here are some recommendations for SSH configuration. One recommendation: disable root login. Set permit root login to no in SSHD config. Number two, use strong encryption. Choose algorithms like AES-256 and disable weak ciphers. Make sure the encryption is strong. Third, Restrict access by IP, like I was saying earlier, limited to only certain computers. Use allow users or allow groups to limit login sources. So you do allow groups, for example. Let's say you want to make it where only 3 computers have access to it. That's what you would do. Monitoring and logging SSH success. It is critical for SSH access and the usage of the activity for unauthorized purposes should be logged. Among the critical things to be undertaken is SSH logging enablement and the application of intrusion detection tools. So, make sure you are monitoring who is accessing what, when they are accessing it. Make sure that people who are not authorized are accessing it, and enabling the application of intrusion detection tools helps you detect threats easier and helps you detect who and what is accessing what data. So, here are some recommendations for monitoring and logging. So, the first recommendation is enable verbose logging. Make sure to set log level to verbose in SSHD config. Number 2, use fail to ban. Monitor and block IPs after multiple failed login attempts, because even though it could be somebody else, somebody trusted, and they forgot their password, later on you can deal with that. You can give them access again. But it could be somebody who's trying to crack your password and they just can't figure it out. And they're sitting there struggling. So automatically blocking it is great. Number 3, regularly review logs. Automate log review to identify unusual access patterns. Make sure you're seeing who and when is accessing at what times. Look at the logs. If you don't look at the logs and keep up, you might not understand how something happened. But if you do this, it's nearly impossible for somebody to take your data or crack it or whatever it is, try to get in without you being prepared or knowing it happening or seeing it happening. Securing SSH ports and firewall. So, locking down the SSH port and the correct configuration of the firewall will minimize the vulnerability of being attacked. So what does that mean? Well, if you lock down the SSH port and the correct configuration of the firewall, meaning if you put the firewall properly and lock the SSH port, the chance of your firewall being bypassed is minimal, and it makes it way less vulnerable. So, changing the default SSH ports and firewall configurations can minimize the threat of being attacked. Because default, a lot of people might know the default and they might know ways around it. Same thing with the firewall configuration, same thing. So if you change it up a little bit, it makes it more unpredictable, it makes it more difficult to crack for somebody trying to get in. So, 3 recommendations for securing SSH ports and firewall. Number 1, change default SSH port. Make sure to modify the port directive in SSHD config to a non-standard port. Number 2, configure firewalls. Only allow SSH from trusted IP addresses. Anything that you're not even 100% sure on, 95%, do not. Just don't do it. Number three, use port knocking. Set up port knocking as an additional layer of security. Port knocking is very useful and it's just an extra layer. It's not too bad, it's fine. And this is the end of the presentation. Thank you.